Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into Chapter 5 of Perverting Our Reproductive Nature, titled The Decline of Traditional Relationships. The author lays out a really striking thesis here. They argue that the massive relationship struggles we're seeing all around us today, they aren't just sudden phenomena popping up out of nowhere. Instead, the book suggests they are actually the downstream results of much earlier cultural and technological shifts. It's a fascinating look at how the modern landscape of love and marriage got so fundamentally altered.
Okay, let's dive into this. The author asks us to think about human connection and traditional marriage kind of like a house. Now, society didn't just swing a giant wrecking ball and destroy it overnight, right? Instead, as the book argues, cultural shifts methodically pulled out the nails. They removed the beams, one by one, over decades. So by the time the foundation finally gave way, people were totally shocked by the collapse, even though, according to the text, this dismantling had literally been happening right under our noses for generations. To really wrap our heads around this collapse, the book points to a very specific domino effect, and it starts all the way back in Chapter 1. Remember the widespread introduction of hormonal birth control? The author argues that structurally separated sex from its natural consequence, reproduction. Well, that domino knocked right into the rise of pornography and dating apps, which we unpacked in Chapters 2 and 3, which essentially gamified pleasure and separated intimacy from genuine connection. And that brings us to the climax we're looking at today, the decline of marriage itself. The text claims this final shift removed the expectation of permanence from commitment, basically fracturing the last foundational brick in the house of human connection.
So, what's the psychology behind all of this? Well, the author leans heavily on social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's concept of safetyism. Basically, this is the idea that our culture has elevated emotional safety to the highest possible good. It's kind of like wrapping young adults in emotional bubble wrap. The book argues that by smoothing out the road and shielding people from discomfort, society has inadvertently created a fragile generation. Through this lens, delaying adulthood and avoiding marriage aren't just practical financial choices. The text presents them as emotional coping strategies. Real covenantal marriage requires a ton of vulnerability. It requires sacrifice, and the risk of getting hurt. And the argument here is that a generation raised on safetyism is just fundamentally unequipped for the rugged, messy demands of lasting intimacy.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real-world impact of that hesitation. Take a look at this fascinating 2019 data from the Pew Research Center. It shows that 58% of married individuals report their relationship is going very well, with really high levels of trust. But for cohabiting partners, that number drops off pretty significantly to just 41%. The text uses this exact data to argue that cohabitation, which it frames as essentially playing house without that foundational vow of permanence, yields measurably lower trust and satisfaction. From the outside, the structure might look exactly the same, but the author suggests the foundation is built on a totally different premise, one where the exit door is basically always left wide open. Now, as traditional marriage declines, alternative structures are rushing in to fill that void. We're talking about open relationships, polyamory, thruples, and relationship anarchy. And while these are becoming way more mainstream and are often championed as signs of an enlightened society, the book takes a critically different stance here. It argues that these setups are actually symptoms of a culture completely unmoored from its original design. So while these alternatives promote big buzzwords like freedom and fluidity, the text posits that they ultimately just dilute commitment and erode the boundaries that have historically safeguarded our intimacy.
Let's zoom in on the most extreme of these alternatives, relationship anarchy. Imagine a dynamic that just flat out rejects all relational norms, hierarchies, labels, and expectations. It even rejects the idea of prioritizing a life partner. The book points to this as the ultimate elimination of the covenant. Think about it. In a world where every single interaction requires its own unique negotiation and there's no agreed-upon structure whatsoever, betrayal technically ceases to exist. But, the author argues, so does lasting trust. According to the text, this philosophy turns love from something transformational, where two people actually grow and sacrifice for one another, into something purely transactional, based entirely on shifting personal preferences.
Let's move to and see how this builds across a highly charged historical timeline mapped out by the author. Pre-1960s, the argument goes that marriage was institutionally centered around legacy, family, and procreation. Then, the 1960s normalized birth control, which the book says shifted the focus away from creating life and toward enhancing adult happiness. Finally, the author points to the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court ruling. The text presents the controversial case that by legally severing marriage from biological sex and its procreative foundation, that ruling implicitly turned marriage from a purposeful covenant into a contract, one based purely on subjective emotional affirmation. The text suggests that this whole timeline actually represents a tragic cultural downgrade. It argues that what began as a sacred vow essentially became a social experiment. As the book puts it, we traded permanence for preference and children for convenience. The author strongly asserts that erasing these traditional boundaries hasn't brought society the massive freedom it was promised. Instead, the argument is that treating marriage as just a flexible lifestyle choice or a companionship of convenience has led to intense social fragmentation. By prioritizing autonomy and desire over design and accountability, the text claims we've inherited an era marked by profound isolation and loneliness.
To really emphasize the stakes here, the author anchors this philosophical argument in a fascinating sociological reality. According to the Brookings Institution, the absolute #1 predictor of a child's future success isn't income. It isn't race. It isn't even education. It is family structure, specifically being raised in a stable two-parent home. The author uses this data point to show that the collapse of the marriage house isn't just some private issue between consenting adults. It directly and disproportionately impacts the next generation, essentially stripping them of the fortress that historically protected and guided them. So the crucial point is that this cultural bankruptcy, according to the book, stems directly from severing sex, love, and parenting from responsibility and permanence. And the fallout? Well, the text argues it's totally measurable. Society is seeing higher rates of loneliness, much lower rates of interpersonal trust, millions of boys growing up without fathers, and a literal epidemic of anxiety and emotional instability. The text insists, quite bluntly, that you cannot dismantle the foundational institution of a civilization and just expect the people living inside it to remain unharmed. But it's important to note the chapter doesn't end on a note of total despair. The author proposes a specific solution, arguing that the answer is not regression, but restoration, not nostalgia, but reclaiming what was good, true, and designed. The goal here isn't to perfectly recreate a flawed past, but rather to stop abandoning the institution of marriage altogether. The text strongly advocates for rebuilding the foundation by voluntarily returning to rightly ordered, sacrificial, and covenantal love. It argues that true freedom is actually found in commitment, not in endless, boundaryless consumption.
Ultimately, Chapter 5 sets up the broader thesis of the entire book, that human beings were designed for union, legacy, and covenant, and that pushing against that design has severe consequences. To truly flourish, the author argues we must once again decide that lifelong commitment is absolutely worth fighting for. Which leaves us with a really critical question to chew on. In an era of endless options and zero boundaries, are we brave enough to choose the vulnerability of permanence? That wraps up our explainer on this pivotal chapter. If you want to dive deeper into the author's work, support them, and explore the interactive companion site, be sure to visit pervertingourreproductivenature.com. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep seeking to understand the ideas that shape our world.